You know that feeling you get when you're in the middle of a D&D session and you or one of your players wants to do something that totally is not in the rules, but it's actually kind of a super sick idea, so you end up kind of making something up, but it really isn't a very sustainable way of doing things, but now it's done, so you've kind of committed yourself, and it's pretty hard to back out of it. Yeah. So I want to have less of those things. With development for One D&D well underway and with 2 Unearthed Arcanas under our belts, now seems like as good a time as any to discuss 5 things that I would love to see included in One D&D that I think would really elevate the game to the next level. None of the things that I'm going to mention today will be class specific. Most of these are really going to be focused on mechanics or game systems as a whole. And yes, I know that everything in the game can be homebrewed, but that really is not the point of this video. This video is really about just coming up with a few fun ideas that I would love to see printed in official books, despite how unlikely a lot of these might be. But in any case, be sure to let me know what you want to see included in One D&D in the comments below. Crafting magical items in Dungeons & Dragons is, to put it mildly, awful. And to be clear and to get ahead of it, I understand why they need to be like this. Magical items not only have some of the most game-breaking potential, but they also should feel like rewards, and they should not feel like they're particularly easy to come by or even to just create, and especially for the powerful ones. This is actually kind of part of where D&D's sort of weird rarity system comes into play, because in Dungeons & Dragons, in contrast to a lot of other games, rarity does not necessarily equal power, though in many cases it does. Rarity in D&D tends to actually align a lot more with the true definition of the word itself, which is that it has a lot more to do with the actual lore and thematic reasons for why there may only be 1 or 2 of a specific item in the known world. The problem that I have with the crafting rules as written in Dungeons & Dragons is that they really kind of only work in one particular type of campaign, and those are the incredibly long-term campaigns that also have large story arc gaps. While some of the updated rules for crafting in Xanathar's Guide to Everything did help improve the situation a little bit, it's still simply just not workable for most games. Even crafting a rare magical item takes 10 work weeks, which is 50 days, working 8 hours per day, and 2,000 gold pieces, plus a formula or rare ingredient required for actually crafting this item in the first place. As far as the gold cost is concerned, that's honestly not really that big of a deal. This can easily be overcome by a particularly generous DM if that's the way that they wanted to take it. But when you stop to consider the time investment involved, that's where things kind of get a little bit more tricky. Shortening the time period that's allocated to crafting this magical item can not only completely devalue that item itself, but also the rarity system as a whole. But at the same time, using these suggested times likely just will not work in the confines of the majority of campaigns. Honestly, I would be shocked if even 10% of campaigns allowed for this kind of downtime to be dedicated to crafting equipment, let alone crafting very rare or legendary items. The need for a formula or for a unique ingredient for some kind of a rare or fantastical beast doesn't really seem to be a problem in my eyes, as in my experience, this tends to be the catalyst for a player wanting to craft a magical item in the first place, so I think that's fine. Honestly though, I'm really not sure what the actual solution is here, but I do feel like it involves a combination of some sort of a rework or revamp of the rarity system to align with power, but also adjusting the work time in some way. I don't know that that's a good solution though, it's just kind of what I can think of off the top of my head. Alternatively, if they created 2 different rule sets or guidelines to choose from, similarly to how you can pick sort of the amount of magic that's available or present in your game, creating something like an expedited crafting rules or a normal crafting rules would be kind of an interesting in-between option, and that way different players can get different types of experiences from the game depending on the type of campaign that they're in. Crafting magical items can be such a fun and satisfying aspect of the game for both the player and the DM, especially when it's something that one of your players kind of comes up with on their own. And I just feel like this is such a heavily underutilized or just dramatically modified rule anyway. I would love to see a new version of these incorporated into One D&D moving forward. Next up, I would love to see an improved use for intelligence. It's no secret that intelligence is largely a dump stat. Of the 13 available classes in D&D right now, only 2, the Wizard and the Artificer, actually use it as their primary ability. Eldritch Knight Fighters and Arcane Trickster Rogues do also use their intelligence, but it does tend to be much lower than their respective primary stat. Intelligence in D&D actually used to play much more of a pivotal role. I discussed this at length in my History of the Wizard class video, so if you haven't seen that, be sure to check it out. I'll leave a link here as well as in the description below, but essentially intelligence was used for so many different things, including things from the language that you knew, from being able to spot illusions immediately, to deciding which spells the player could know or cast. But in 5th edition, its usefulness has largely been completely diluted. Outside of Wizard and Artificer, which use it for their primary abilities and almost require a high intelligence score, the only other common use for intelligence is essentially making investigation checks and arcana checks as well. The result of this is obviously that it has led many players to simply just drop their lowest ability score into intelligence because they just don't see the value in having a high score. And that makes sense. I would love to see intelligence become a competitive stat again. I want there to be a reason for a player to want to have a higher intelligence modifier, and preferably in a way that is not directly tied to damage. Something like increasing the amount of languages a player can know for either, each point above 14 or for each +1 modifier, or alternatively granting an additional skill proficiency for each +1 above 12. The tricky part here is obviously the balance. The benefit cannot be something so good that you feel like you're missing out or that you're impairing your character if you don't invest in it. It cannot feel mandatory. But at the same time, it should also feel like a justifiable and warrantable reason to want to dedicate extra stats into that instead of allocating them somewhere else. Before we move on to what I think is the craziest and definitely the least likely one to ever get implemented, if you enjoy the type of content that I make, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It is a very simple gesture that goes an incredibly long way to helping other people find my content. I've been putting a ton of effort into One D&D videos, so any support would be greatly appreciated. So the third thing that I'd love to see included in One D&D that is totally never going to happen, but is also tangentially related to intelligence. If you think of just about any fantasy show or book or movie, there is essentially always at least one moment where a character or some kind of a magic user will sacrifice something or some part of themselves to channel some incredibly powerful magic that may or may not even end up working or achieving the desired effect. It's a trope of the genre, and honestly, a really cool and flavorful one at that. I think this, what I'm calling overcasting spells, would be a really interesting and kind of a cool way to incorporate something like a 10th level spell into the game. I'm not really sure whether we should be seeing new unique spells at 10th level, or if these should just be incredibly powerful versions of other spells in the game. I don't really know, I haven't landed exactly where I think, but I just feel that this would make for such a cool and pivotal decision point for a character if they ever decided to go through with it. The downside of the sacrifice that is made to overcast the spell should be something that is significant. Perhaps something like losing a level or 5 max rolls of hit dice worth of hit points that cannot be recovered, losing spell slots, lowering an ability score permanently. There are just so many different avenues that you can take to kind of expand on this. Ultimately though, sadly, no, if I'm honest with myself, I don't think that anything like this will ever realistically see printing in the D&D book, but I just think it's such a cool idea that I wanted to discuss it here. The fourth thing that I'd love to see included in One D&D is everyone's favorite that we've been talking about it forever, and that is improved melee classes. We have had the reveal and the confirmation of the warrior group of classes, but we don't really know at this point in time what any of those will look like yet. So this is something that I and pretty much everyone in the D&D community has been talking about for years, and incidentally, I also have a video all about this as well if you want to check it out. The crux of the issue is that essentially, on average, melee characters are far less effective than their spellcasting counterparts in combat, and particularly so at mid to higher levels of play. One of the many reasons for this is that spells simply offer far more damage and versatility as compared to the available weapon pool. While I don't think it's actually necessary for martial classes and weapons to deal an equivalent amount of damage as casters, I do think that upgrading their available actions would really go a long way to improving the options available to these classes, namely barbarians, fighters, and rogues. One common suggestion is to take some of the Battlemaster maneuvers and move them into the available action pool for martial classes. The reason for this is primarily that it would no longer require the player or the character to decide between damage or utility, which is something that spellcasters rarely need to do. For example, the grappling strike maneuver allows the character to grapple as part of their attack action, as compared to the normal grapple, which replaces the attack. I do not think that they should be getting the entire maneuver pool. I think it should be limited to a select few, but kind of valuable and logical ones. As a recent commenter also pointed out in this video, it seems a little bit insane that a 20th level paladin is incapable of disarming their opponent. In addition to this, I do think that tying these maneuvers into weapon updates would be ideal. We've already seen the change to the light weapon property, which now allows a character to make a second attack without expending a bonus action, and short swords have recently also been moved into the light weapons category. So it is clear that Wizards of the Coast is exploring different ways to shake up melee characters' damage output and versatility, so I would absolutely love to see some adjustments in 1D&D in this vein. For example, allowing reach weapons to disarm or trip, or allowing heavy weapons to push or block can add so much versatility and flavor and immersion into the game that it's kind of hard for me to argue against it. Admittedly though, and on that point, this probably would involve a pretty hefty rework to stat blocks and to creatures and even characters to a large extent. So I can understand why they may be very hesitant to do it, but it doesn't stop me from wanting it anymore. So lastly, the fifth thing that I would love to see included in 1D&D is some sort of a fix to the yo-yo. Yet another topic that I've made a whole video about. When I say fixing the yo-yo, I am essentially referring to the fact that going unconscious during combat is effectively without penalty in 5th edition. The core reason for this is that characters are just as effective at 1 hit point as they are at 100 hit points. And as there's no lingering effect to going unconscious, players generally lack an incentive to do otherwise. There are actually a number of very viable solutions to this issue, and one that I had actually mentioned in my previous video as being far too punishing actually seems like quite a reasonable option in the context of the current 1D&D rule set, and that is exhaustion. Previously, the idea of giving a character who goes unconscious during combat a level of exhaustion, while thematically valid, was mechanically crippling. 5th edition rules for exhaustion would have effectively marked that character for death, but under the current 1D&D rules, this idea actually seems fine. Punishing a player with a cumulative -1 on D20 tests each time they go unconscious does not seem like an unreasonable trade to me, and may actually be one of the more elegant and simple solutions to the problem that has been plaguing 5th edition since its inception. 1D&D is actually shaping up to be much more of a change than I was originally anticipating, and I do believe that with enough feedback and with the seemingly open-mindedness of the development team, we can truly shape this game to be incredible and something that will last for decades more. Let me know in the comments below what you would love to see updated or removed or added to 1D&D, and be sure to subscribe for more content, and also check out some of the videos linked on screen if you like this content, or maybe some more information about the history of D&D. But otherwise, take care.